Hey class, a couple of announcements before we begin. First of all, I did get confirmation yesterday that I can open up my final exam for you guys the whole day of the final exam day. You don't have to set aside that 2-hour block of time that we would have normally met and taken the final. So the final will be just like you have taken the exam in mastering. You'll have, from 12 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. to go in and take that exam on the final exam day. And then once you start the exam, you'll have so many minutes to complete it, but you do not have to block out that 2-hour block of time for this class. Other classes might be different, so check with those instructors, but I'm going to keep with the asynchronous thing and just allow you to take the test anytime during that day. And I don't have the day right in front of me. I think it's probably the Friday of finals week, but you can double check that and there'll be announcements as we get closer. A couple of extra credit opportunities. Don't forget the idea surveys that were sent to your student email account. Check those out, get with your computer or whatever and fill those out if you haven't already. If you have, thank you very much. I appreciate those very much. I enjoy your feedback and look for opportunities to better classes for the next year. So remember, I don't get to see what you wrote as far as being tied to your name. I do get a list of people who have or have not completed the idea surveys, but I never know who said what exactly. And I don't even get to see anything until well after grades are posted. So don't worry about me doing something crazy to your grade. I would never do that anyway. Another extra credit opportunity is on your lab assignment today. There will be a lab that is in the lab folder on D2L. It is a case study. And you'll complete that case study and drop it into Dropbox. And number 18, the very last question on that lab, is extra credit. Okay, so that one's optional and you're welcome to do that for a little bit of extra credit. All right, so I think that's it for announcements. We'll go ahead and get with chapter 27, ecology, population ecology. And so, a couple of definitions here at first. An ecosystem is basically all of the organisms in an area along with their non-living environment. Okay, so it's all the organisms of all species. Okay, and actually we'll learn about this next time, but this is called a community. And so a community plus the environment is an ecosystem, okay? And the study of these interactions between organisms of the same and different species and their environment is known as ecology, okay? So that's the definition of basically this unit that we're studying now to finish up the semester. Way back on day 1 of Biology 111, we started off talking about populations, communities. We talked about the atomic level, cellular level, and we had that whole hierarchy. So we first saw the term population then, and then we spent quite a bit of time at the beginning of this semester with natural selection and the evolution unit talking about population. So you probably don't need me to define it for you. But just a refresher, just to remind you that a population is defined as all of the members of a particular species in a specific area at the same time. Okay, so you guys met some of my chickens in the lab video from last class. They're all the members of the same species. They live on my property in the same area at the same time. They're a population. About 3/4 of a mile down the road, my neighbor has some chickens as well. And so they would be their own little population of chickens. Okay, so same members or same species, same place, same time. Okay, now this next little bit that we're going to look at is going to be looking at population size changes. Okay, and maybe right above the slide you can write, don't really have any room, but you could write that changes, and if you've had college algebra or other math, you know that the delta sign or the little triangle sign means change. So changes in population size are mainly due to two factors. One, what we call natural increase, and the other one is net migration. Okay, so those are going to be the two main factors that are going to drive changes in population, or how many individuals there are in a particular population. Okay, so this natural increase thing, okay, natural increase is basically the difference between births and deaths. So you take the number of births, you subtract out the number of deaths, and you find that a difference, and that's the natural increase. And this number can be positive or it can be negative. A natural increase is positive if there's more births than there are deaths, or it could be negative if there's more deaths than there are births. Okay, so that's the concept of natural increase. Net migration is, again, a subtraction problem. Basically, immigration, which is individuals moving into the population, minus emigration, those moving out of the population. Okay, so when a population changes because of natural increase or net migration, there's an equation we can use. Okay, so that change in population size is going to be equal to natural increase minus net migration. And remember, natural increase is birth number minus death number. Okay, and net migration is immigration minus emigration. Okay, so you would take this value, subtract this value, and you would get the change in population size. Okay. Now, growth rate, which is represented by a lowercase r, of a population is basically the change in the population size over time for a particular period of time. Could be months, could be weeks, could be years, could be minutes or hours if we're talking about microbial populations. Okay, so population growth rate is basically the birth rate, okay, minus the death rate, and this is all in a particular time frame. And so we can represent this by R is equal to birth rate minus the death rate. Okay, growth rate is equal to births minus death rate. So we have an example here. We have 100 adult white-tailed deer, 50 are male, 50 are female. Okay, those 50 females give birth to twins each year. So you have 100 fawns. Okay, the birth rate for this population is going to be 1.0 because you had 100 adults, you have 100 fawns, you divide those and you get 1.0. Okay, so for every individual, there's another one individual that's born. Okay, so that's the birth rate. Now, the death rate in this particular population is 70. Okay, so predators, hunting, probably a lot of other factors, competition, a lot of different things can cause this deaths in this population. And so if we had 70 die out of 100, that gives us 0.7. So our growth rate would be, remember, R minus equals B minus D. So R is going to equal 1.0, because that's our birth rate, minus 0.7. and that's going to give us a growth rate of 0.3. Okay, so our R is 0.3. Now we can take this information and calculate the growth rate per unit of time, and that's going to be represented with a big G. And with this, we're going to calculate it by multiplying the growth rate times the number of individuals, the population size, the number of individuals at the beginning of the time interval. So for the deer, G is going to be equal to 0.3, because that's what our R was, our growth rate, times N, which is 100. And that's going to give us 30 individuals per year. Okay, so our population size is going to change by 30 individuals per year. And this growth rate can remain constant, at a constant growth rate. G and N both increase with each successive time interval. Okay, now, as we saw with natural selection, these nice little neat situations don't necessarily happen in the real world, okay? So these equations kind of give us some estimates for what these populations could look like. So they're going to be an estimate. It's not going to be exact. And the environmental conditions aren't going to stay the same for very long. So birth and death rates can fluctuate from year to year, and could be from season to season as well. But we can graph population size changes. And when we do that, we can see some different patterns of growth. A constant positive growth rate adds more people or organisms to the population over time. And this is going to be called exponential growth. Okay, and so when we graph those, an exponential growth is going to make a J-shaped curve. Okay, now this doesn't need to have a high growth rate. It's just basically a constant growth rate. All right, it may not be really high. It's just constantly positive. So here this shows an example of that. We said our one population of deer was 0.3. Okay, another population or maybe another year might be 0.2 or 0.1. Okay, so these would be exponential growth curves. They kind of look like the letter J. Okay, and so you can see may not be really high, but it's just constant growth. Okay. The maximum possible growth rate at which a population can increase is known as the biotic potential. So that's a term you might want to star there because you'll need to know that one. So basically, as fast as they can grow, that's going to be their biotic potential. And this is an estimation, and it's going to assume ideal environmental conditions that are going to maximize birth rate and minimize death rate. Okay, this is going to be like ideal situations where birth rate is at the maximum, death rate is at the minimum, and you get high growth rates. Some things that can influence biotic potential. One is going to be age at first reproduction. Okay, another one is frequency of reproduction. How many offspring can they have per year, per month, per whatever. Average number of offspring produced. The organism's reproductive lifespan. Does it only reproduce for a year? Does it reproduce for 10 years? What is that like? And then what is the death rate under ideal situations? Okay, is it low? Is it high? What does that look like? Populations tend to fail to reach their biotic potential because of environmental resistance, and that's going to incur biotic, okay, or living and abiotic or non-living. A means without, right? Non-living factors. Some examples of biotic factors could be predation and competition for resources. And then some abiotic factors could be like hurricanes, fires, droughts, floods, things like that. Okay, exponential growth in a natural population is always temporary. Okay, it's not going to stay that way forever. Like I said, a natural population. In microbiology, we learned about how microbial populations can be kept in exponential growth using what's called a fermentation vat and a chemostat, basically keeping environmental conditions perfect to keep growth rate in that exponential form. But again, that's not a natural situation. Environmental resistance basically forces that population to kind of back off from that exponential growth. Temporary exponential growth in populations can that kind of recurs, can undergo cycles of growth, rapid growth, exponential growth, followed by massive die-offs. And these are what we would call boom and bust cycles. So here's an example here where this is a lemming in Canada. Population growth is exponential here, and then oops, and then they drop off, exponential drop off. And you get this kind of up and down, boom and bust type of cycle. Okay, and a lot of times this is going to be associated with changes in temperature, food availability, perhaps rainfall, and those kinds of things. And also the Arctic hare and the Canada lynx, it's a classical model, maybe you've probably already seen it, where they'll kind of follow each other. The hare populations will go up, lynx populations will also go up, and then they'll crash as well because they're interdependent upon each other. Let's see. So this is like kind of what we've talked about, you know, they'll graze really well, have plenty of food, and then they will overgraze, damage their habitat, and then the death rate will really pick up, and there will be a lack of food. Okay. Also, as there's more and more of them, there will be an increase of predators. And then overcrowding will have stress and could introduce parasites and pathogens as well to bring that population back down when they get overcrowded. So an exponential curve is a J-shaped curve, okay? A logistic curve is a little bit different, and a logistic curve is when new populations or populations begin to stabilize as a result of that environmental resistance. Okay, so the maximum population size that can be sustained for an extended period of time without damaging the ecosystem is represented by a little k, that's an lowercase k, by the way, is called carrying capacity. And that's another example of a term that you'll need to know. And that's basically the maximum number of organisms that that environment can withstand, okay? And factors involved in that would be nutrients, energy, space, Okay, things that will help determine what that carrying capacity, what that level is actually going to be. So population grows in its ecosystem until it reaches the carrying capacity, and then it will start to level out. Okay, we call this an S-shaped curve. Okay, that's the logistic curve. And in nature, a logistic curve can happen when species move or migrate into a new habitat. Okay, they'll establish, they're getting along really good, and then the environmental kind of provides some resistance to slow that population growth back down towards the carrying capacity. So this line here would be the carrying capacity. This is that S-shaped logistic type curve. So you have rapid population growth, slowing growth, and then growth will stay near that carrying capacity. Now, in nature, populations will overshoot the carrying capacity from time to time and have to be brought back down. Small overshoots above the carrying capacity will be followed by a decrease in the population to a level below the carrying capacity. And once the resources recover, the original carrying capacity can be restored. And so the population size will fluctuate around that carrying capacity. Okay, so check out this graph. Okay, here is the original carrying capacity, the original K here at this level. And we're looking at over time, this is numbers of individuals, okay? So let's take a look at this here. All right, so this red line, individuals really took off, tons of exponential growth. Oh, way overshot the carrying capacity, did a lot of damage to the environment. Okay, if it's extreme damage to the environment, that population's going to die out. Okay, if it's just moderate or pretty severe damage to the environment, but the population can recover, a lot of times they will not ever make it back to this original carrying capacity, at least for a long time, because they've done so much damage to their habitat. And so they will fluctuate then down here by a new carrying capacity at a lower level. Okay. And then compare that to the green line where they overshot just a little bit and they can still maintain here near the original carrying capacity. Okay, so here's another example here. Looks like caribou, and I believe there's a question on this in your homework as well. Looking at numbers of caribou, these are trend lines. Oops, I guess they're not trend lines. Exponential growth with these blue dots here. Okay, way, way overshot. 2,000, probably closer to, I don't know, 700 is their carrying capacity. Way overshot, crashed way down, well below the carrying capacity after that. Okay. So there's a few things that are going to kind of regulate that population growth within the environment. There's the biotic and the abiotic factors. And some of those factors depend on the population density, okay? So density independent factors limit populations regardless of population density. And population density is basically the number of individuals per unit area. Okay, so 10 bull elk per square mile. Okay, something like that. So the density independent factors are going to limit populations. Doesn't matter if there's 10 per square mile or 1,000 per square mile, doesn't matter. These are things like weather, hurricanes, fires, droughts, you know, things that doesn't really matter how many there are, they're still going to limit the population, even if there's a lot or a little. Density dependent factors, though, have larger effects as population density increases. So density dependent factors are going to really affect a big population, the 1,000 per square mile versus the 10 per square mile. Okay, the 1,000 per square mile is going to be much more greatly affected. These are going to include interactions like predation, parasitism, competition, and again, these are going to be more strongly affecting populations as their density increases. So you get the 1,000 individuals per square mile, they're a lot closer together, going to be more susceptible to predators because there's a whole bunch of them. There's a lot more competition for resources, a lot of chances for disease and parasites when there's a whole bunch of individuals together as well. Okay, so predation is a huge density dependent population control. Okay, you guys know all these terms already. You know what predator and prey is. You know what carnivores and herbivores are. Parasites, we know what those are as well. A parasite is an organism that lives in or on a larger animal organism called a host. Okay, those parasites feed on the host and generally harm the host. And they can include tapeworms. We've talked about microorganisms. We talked about liver flukes before spring break, those types of things. Parasites, again, have density dependent effects on populations. They can kill the host outright, or they can weaken them so that they are more susceptible to predation or harsh weather conditions or something like that. Competition for resources is definitely a big one that controls population growth. There's so many tons of food or pounds of food. There's so much space. There's so much water that's available. So competition will be important. And competition is basically interactions that harm the individuals that are interacting. This is definitely density dependent because competition is much more intense on large populations, more dense populations. Okay, so there's two types of competition. There's interspecific and intraspecific. Interspecific is competition between members of the same species. Okay, competition that's interspecific is competition between members of the same species. So two of those white-tailed deer competing over a mate or competing over a water source. Okay, intraspecific is competition between members of different species. Okay, so members of, you know, a coyote population may be competing with the bobcats over food sources. Okay, that's intraspecific competition. Okay, now population size is definitely, like we saw, dependent upon the natural increase, right? The number of births and number of deaths. And one way we can look at that is through life histories. And life history is basically an indicator of survivorship and reproductive capabilities. Okay, so life history is an indicator of survivorship and reproductive capabilities. And a life history is going to include many different factors. Again, age at first reproduction, number of offspring produced, amount of energy and resources used to raise the offspring. And all of these things, life histories really vary a lot among species. These life histories are going to reflect trade-offs between number of offspring and offspring survival. Okay, so at one end of the extreme, okay, we call those R-selected species. They have evolved characteristics that favor rapid reproduction, reproducing, several times in a season, or several times in a month, or whatever for some insects. Okay, they mature rapidly, have a large number of offspring, but they have a short lifespan. Okay, and they provide little or no parental care. And here's a mosquito here laying eggs in water. Okay, they're going to reproduce often. They mature really quickly, have a pretty short lifespan, and produce a lot of offspring. Okay, these are going to have some boom and bust cycles as well. On the other end of the spectrum is the K-selected species. They're going to have a long lifespan. Produce small numbers of fairly large offspring, and provide some significant parental care. Okay, so if you think of a human or an elephant, how much time is put into raising the offspring, and how much time is in between reproductive intervals. Okay, so the parents allow a higher percentage of time and investment to their offspring, so that they can really make sure that that one or the few numbers of offspring that they have make it. Whereas the R-select is like, oh, let's have a whole bunch of them and hope, a few make it. Okay, so it's just a difference in time and devotion to different aspects of survival for the offspring. So species life history kind of predicts survival rates over time. Okay, and again, they're going to really vary a lot, and basically in their chances of dying at a particular phase in their life cycle. And we call these, or we track these differences in what's called the survivorship table, which is going to track same age groups of organisms throughout their lives. Okay, so they're going to be the same age block, and to see how many survive each year. Okay, so at the beginning of the first year, at the very beginning, there's 100,000 individuals. Okay, and maybe this is days, probably not years. Okay, say 90 days later, only about 24% or 23.6% of them are still alive. Okay, and this is a way that we can look at survivorship. That's a survivorship table. We can also look at what we call survivorship curves. When we plot out that data, survivorship curve, and there's three types of survivorship curves. There's late loss, constant loss, and early loss. And in other textbooks, this is called a type 1 survivorship curve, type 2, and type 3 survivorship curves. And they're going to be named for the lifespan period of time in which the most deaths occur. So some are early, some are kind of equal, early and late, and then some are late. So type 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so late loss, in general, most humans and those organisms with a type 1 survivorship curve would, most deaths occur later in life. Okay, with a constant loss, equal chance of loss or death at birth versus, you know, several months or years later. And then a type 3 is, a lot of them don't make it past the first, you know, few days, few months, or early part of the lifespan. Okay, so late loss populations, most or many survive to old age. Okay, and we know that's not true for 100% of individuals, but most. Characteristics like humans are usually larger animals and more long-lived, like we saw with the elephant, mountain sheep. These species produce relatively few offspring compared to like the mosquito, and are nourished and taken care of by their parents for at least some time early in life. The constant loss is when individuals have an equal chance of dying at any time of their lifespan. They're just as likely to die toward the end of their lifespan as they are at the beginning. And let's just define this. Lifespan is the number of years an organism can possibly live. For a human, that's 120 years, okay? For other organisms, it may be 1 year. Let's see. Oh, excuse me. So asexually reproducing organisms like bacteria, Hydra, which is a cnidarian that we looked at, birds, turtles, lab animals, or lab organisms. They would have kind of a constant loss population, or type 2 population, and they would have they would be kind of in that K selected species type survivorship curve. Late loss would be an R selected. Early loss, again, this would be with a high death rate among the young individuals. Survivorship curve is going to be concave. Okay, many die when they're very young. Examples of here would be, I lied, whoa, back. This would also be the K selected. Sorry, wrong one. Early loss would be things like invertebrates, insects, fish, amphibians, plants, and so forth. These would be more like the R selected species. Mice, prey animals would fall in this area as well. Small prey animals like mice and other rodents. Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit and look at how organisms are distributed. Okay, how are populations distributed? How are individuals within a population, I should say, how are they distributed? Okay, we've looked at numbers. Okay, we know that they're in a certain area because they're a population. So now we're going to look at patterns of spacing or patterns of distribution. Okay, so this is looking at really the number, population distribution is the number of individuals per unit area. Okay, which is also their, population density. Okay, is the number of individuals per unit area. Population distribution is how they are spread out in the area. Okay, so there may be 10 per square mile, but are they all in one area or are they spaced out? Okay, that's what we're going to look at. So there's a couple of different types of distribution patterns. The first one is clumped. Then there's uniform and random. So clumped distribution would be like a family or social groups, a flock of birds, an elephant herd, schools of fish, things like that. Okay, so they're clumped in this area. Okay. Some advantages of being clumped. There's a lot of eyes to look for prey, food or predators. Reduce the odds of one individual being attacked by a predator. So, you know, if you're in a whole bunch, what are the odds that they're going to get you? And then increases an individual's risk of finding, or chance, or could be risk of finding a mate. Uniform distribution, okay, is where they're basically equally spread out. And a good example that they use in a lot of textbooks is creosote bushes. They're usually evenly spaced due to competition of their roots. There may be seeds. Let's see, do we have a picture? Yes, these are birds, but they're equally spaced. With plants, there may be seeds that allow them to be maybe one seed landed here and seed landed there, but they just outcompete those seeds, those individuals, and only the more dominant ones persist, and they don't get any closer, because if they were closer, there wouldn't be enough resources. Uniform territories also, or uniform distribution also involves animals defending territories. So if you look at this bird here, each one of them is kind of funny, just out of pecking reach of each other. They don't want to get any closer to get pecked, but they kind of space themselves out so they can find food but not get pecked. And then another one is random distribution, where it just kind of varies. Okay, so do you see the difference here? There's a whole bunch here, and then like none here, whereas uniform is evenly spaced. And clumped is much more clumped than random. Okay, so the resources they need probably are pretty well equally distributed through the lawn, like they're using dandelions as an example here. But based on, since they have plenty of nutrients and so forth, they're basically just kind of random wherever the seeds were planted or happened to land. Okay, the rest of this chapter we're going to look briefly at human population growth. And unless you've studied human population growth, this might surprise you. This might be something new. Human population growth has definitely grown exponentially. We're probably still growing exponentially or really close to it, and has that J-shaped curve. Okay, especially in the last couple of centuries. And it's interesting, your book points out that 6% of all people that have ever lived on Earth are alive today. And here's what our population growth looks like. Okay, so in 1804, we had 1 billion people on Earth. Okay, now it's taken all of human history to get to that 1 billion. Then 123 years later, we are at 2 billion. And then 33 years later, 14 years later, 13, 12, and so forth, we have added another billion. Okay, so we've gone from all of human history to 123 years to 33 years to 12 to 14 years, adding a billion to our population. I remember back in 99, I'm old, when we reached 6 billion, and that was like a huge milestone. And then here not too long ago, we reached 7 billion people around the world, people living at one moment on the earth. And pretty soon we'll reach 8 billion as well. But notice these projections are starting to slow down. And here in micro, we talked about the 1918 flu pandemic. We have a pandemic going on right now. Bubonic plague wiped out, what was it, like a quarter or a third of the world's population. You can see the little dip going here. Just thought that was kind of interesting. One other thing I just noticed here as well is they took out quite a bit of years in here. Oh, maybe they didn't. Never mind. I'll be quiet. So in 1963, the human growth rate was at about 2.2, and in 2018, growth rate was closer to 1%. So we're hoping to finally maybe kind of be coming into that S-shaped curve to kind of slow down the exponential growth and maybe get into some logistic growth. By 2050, we're expected to see 9 billion and growing. Like all organisms, we do experience environmental resistance. However, the thing with humans is, though, we have responded to environmental resistance by devising ways to overcome it, like medical and agricultural advancements. Let me go back here just a second. It says medical and industrial advances, okay? The reason that we have had such growth here is because of medical advances, because of advances in sanitation and hygiene and knowing about pathogens and clean water and those types of things. And so that's here, those diseases and things like that kept our growth rates pretty well in check. But now that we know how to overcome some of those challenges and those environmental resistance, now our population growth has really increased. We can use age structures of a population to predict its future growth. Okay, so one thing that we looked at was the age at reproduction and things like that. And remember, population size is due to a combination of natural increase, which is births minus deaths, and migration. Okay, if we take out migration, immigration, and emigration for right now, we're going to just look at natural increase. Okay, we're not going to look at people moving in or out of different areas. Okay, this first example is a representation of the continent of Africa, and it is this represents a rapidly growing population. Okay, so males in an age structure diagram are on one side, females are on the other, and then you have percentage of population on the x-axis, age on the y. And the reason that we can tell this is growing is you have pre-reproductive ages, which is basically 0 to 14. Then this next shaded area here is going to be those in reproductive age, which is 15 to 45. And then you have the post-reproductive age in the lighter tan up here. Okay, so when you look at this, a rapidly growing population will be in the shape of a pyramid, okay, or a triangle. because you have a lot of people in here and in the pre-reproductive ages that are coming up. Okay, so as time goes on, these people down in here are more likely to reproduce and add to the population. Okay, now let me go back. The next one is North America, so you could say US, Canada, Mexico. We have a slowly growing population, okay? Or sometimes we call this stagnant population growth, where it's really slowing way down. And that's something that I don't think most people are aware of. You know, we think of a human population on the worldwide scale, and it is significant. But in the United States, where we're living right now, our population growth is very, very minimal. And we may, in the next few years, actually hit zero population growth, where our population is not growing. And then you look at this example, like in Europe and Japan, you're actually getting a declining population. And those numbers of people are actually declining there. And that causes some concerns with society about who's going to take care of all the old people, who's going to pay the taxes when the old people retire and, you know, aren't working, and you know, who's going to support all of these government programs. And so knowing age structure and being able to predict how many people are going to be present in the future is important for societies. So a slowing population, like in, say, Canada, you start to get more of kind of a rectangular shape with a cone on top. Okay, so if you look at the base of this structure, there's very few in relative proportion to here and some of these areas of the number of individuals that are pre-reproductive. So in the next 20 years, there's not very many people here compared to what's there now or what was there in the past. Okay, so this would indicate that this population is slowing. And then this population, like we could say it's Japan or a number of European countries, where you really have this narrowing down here. Very, very narrow here coming up. Okay, you still have the kind of the little peak here, but it's a very narrow base. Okay, so typically your more developed countries are going to be slowing or have zero or declining population growth. And then those less developed countries like India and some places of Africa are going to be those that are having the higher population growth. And so the darker lines are 2018, and then these kind of more shaded lines here are the projections. Okay, so that finishes up chapter 27 on population ecology. On Tuesday, we'll move into chapter 28, which I believe is community ecology. So don't forget there's that lab. There's a mastering assignment as well, one that is due for chapter 26. This one will be due, chapter 27 is due on Sunday. And if you have any concerns or questions or just want to chat, send me an email or give me a call. Also, if you are graduating, I've been asked to have you send your photos and comments that you'd like to go on the graduation video. Get those sent in soon. Anything else? Register for fall if you're coming back. Don't know what that's going to look like yet. We're planning on having face-to-face classes, but it could still be remote instruction. So don't know there, but enrollment is open and you're welcome to enroll. If you need any help with advising or whatever, I can try to help you or send you to the right person. So Anyway, have a great weekend, and we will see you